Returning to the banks, and the chairman of Bendigo and Adelaide Bank has called for a full parliamentary inquiry into the banking system and its reliance on offshore funding. Robert Johansen also told the company's AGM that he's hoping the Senate inquiry will be more than a whinge session around profits and mortgage rates. Here's Emily Stewart.
While the major banks are under attack, it was a much more relaxed mood at the Bendigo and Adelaide Bank's AGM.
I think it's performing reasonably well in this climate. You know, every bank is having problems.
I think they've come from a very small operation to amalgamation, and well, we can't expect too much too quickly.
The bank might be small, but it has big ambitions.
Funding issues during the GFC depressed competition in Australia's banking industry. And, whilst some overhang remains, government initiatives around sourcing funding for players such as ourselves are providing a platform for second-tier players to take on the major banks.
The Bendigo and Adelaide Bank holds only 2.5% to 3% of market share across Australia, while the Big Four account for around 90%. But in regional areas, it's a big player, and one that's still growing. Last week, buying out the remaining 40% of Elders Rural Bank to make it a wholly owned subsidiary. Last year, the bank posted a profit of more than $240 million after recovering from a disappointing result the previous year due to the global financial crisis. The chairman, Robert Johansen, says he welcomes international banking reforms to try and stop another financial meltdown, and says a Senate inquiry should focus on the financial system rather than looking at Australian banking regulations. He also called for the introduction of incentives to encourage people to invest their superannuation in domestic banks.
Yet we have a pool of savings in superannuation, currently about $1.5 trillion and growing to maybe $5 trillion by 2030, much of which is invested in equities and a lot of that in offshore equities, and surprisingly little in fixed interest or absolute return type securities.
With regional independent politicians now holding the balance of power, the bank is pushing for more than just a shift in the allocation of money for rural areas.
What we are looking for is government to establish the building blocks to encourage and nurture local regional entrepreneurship. Handouts or regional subsidies will only suffocate that spirit.
Meanwhile, the Murray-Darling Basin draft plan was another concern for shareholders, including a former chairman of the company.
I can recall some years ago that the bank took as security some water licences or water rights that farmers held as part of their security for loans that the bank gave them. I'm wanting to know what exposure Bendigo Bank has to water rights held as security against rural loans.
But the board played down the possible impact on the bank.
The total loans in those areas are $1.3 billion, but something like 3% of those are irrigators, so a vast majority of that is dry land farming.
Questions were also asked about interest rates, but just like most of its bigger rivals, the bank says it hasn't yet made any decisions.